Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Psychedelic Liberty Summit Track 3. My name is Emily Williams, and I'm a psychiatrist and psychedelic therapy researcher in San Francisco, California. I'll be your moderator for this morning's sessions in Track 3. Our second presentation is entitled Peyote as Commodity, an examination of market actors and access mechanisms, and is presented by Kevin Feeney. Dr. Feeney is a cultural anthropologist and a lawyer currently working as a program director and instructor in interdisciplinary studies and social sciences at Central Washington University. His primary research interests include examining legal and regulatory issues surrounding the religious and cultural use of psychoactive substances, with an emphasis on peyote and ayahuasca, and exploring modern and traditional uses of Amanita muscaria, with a specific focus on preparation practices. His research has also been published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, among other books and journals. He is a member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. For those of you just joining us, I want to encourage you to submit your questions via the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And remember to check if a similar question has already been asked, and you can upvote those questions to avoid duplication. And the Ask a Question feature is just below the screen at the bottom next to where it says people for the total number of people in the conference currently. So ask your questions and make comments during the presentation, and I'll compile the questions and help field them after the presentation. So let's welcome Kevin to the stage now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here and participating in this conference. I hope your morning has been going well so far, and hopefully some of you had a chance to view Sandor Ironrope's presentation this morning. There are going to be several speakers talking about peyote and peyote-related issues this weekend. So I encourage you to look for those, as they'll be complementary to what I'm talking about, and hopefully work together to add depth to some of the important issues related to peyote and its conservation and religious use. So I have a PowerPoint here that maybe somebody can help me pull this up. Okay, so not sure why the screen is blank. Okay, is this something that needs to be reloaded? Okay, so we're gonna have to troubleshoot this. This was loaded and ready to go just 2 minutes ago. So please bear with me just a second, and we'll get this going again. Okay. Okay, so this function looks like it has stopped working for me. Okay, so I'm going to have to go into entire screen, I guess, and this is going to limit me in some ways. Okay, does this look good to everybody? Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this. So I'll be talking about peyote as commodity. There have been some issues around peyote recently and some controversies, particularly in relation to conservation of peyote as something that is a fairly rare cactus, and also some controversies recently with the Decriminalized nature movement, which has included peyote as one of the plant psychedelics that they're hoping to decriminalize, which has caused some controversies within the Native American church. We won't get to those specifically, but I do want to emphasize that this is a very limited resource, and we do have cultural traditions in the United States going back 150 years or more using this cactus, and this is a very important and sacred resource for lots of people within the Native community. Okay. So hopefully somebody will text me if there are any troubles with the PowerPoint, but hopefully this is what you guys are seeing right now. If it's not, somebody could let me know. That would be wonderful. So just some brief background on the peyote trade itself. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. Okay, now do people see the PowerPoint? Okay, fantastic. Sorry for the hiccups. It was all working and ready to go at 12:10, and this is just how these things work, I guess. So that's my cover page. We'll skip forward, and I'll try to move through some of this a little bit quickly because I do want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. Okay, so briefly, the peyote trade, it goes back about as long as the existence of the Native American Church. This is something that started in South Texas in the late 19th century and started around the time when a lot of the tribes were being moved onto reservations and had limited mobility. So people were no longer able to go harvest for themselves, and a number of Hispanic families picked this up in South Texas and started harvesting and selling to Native Americans that would travel to Texas on horseback or by train to purchase peyote. And this is something that's continued into the present day. When the United States outlawed peyote in 1965, they created an exception for the religious use by Native Americans. And it wasn't until 1969 that Texas then recognized this and started to register members of the Hispanic community in South Texas and license them to sell peyote. So these individuals have to get leases through the federal government. They have to pass background checks. And these historically have been family businesses that are passed down from generation to generation. Sometimes they're passed down from an uncle to their niece or nephew, or sometimes from a mother or father to their son or daughter. But these have been continuing traditions within families. So there's an interesting kind of cultural element to this aspect of peyote as well that's worth considering. Okay. So my dissertation research was based on the peyote trade, and I spent quite a bit of time in South Texas between 2012 and 2015. And you can see a map of the southern part of Texas there. And the gray part is the peyote range in South Texas that is part of the peyote trade market. So I spent time down there and spent time with the licensed distributors, individuals they've hired to pick, landowners. Pretty much all land in Texas is privately owned, and the pickers are not licensed to, or the dealers are not licensed to grow peyote. They can only harvest it from the wild. And this means they need access to land. And that means they have to negotiate with landowners in order to be able to go on the land and harvest peyote. So landowners are a key element in this trade. I also interviewed members of the Native American Church who were coming down to purchase peyote and also participate in ceremonies in South Texas. And finally collected quite a bit of data from the Texas Department of Public Safety that has been compiling data on the trade for about 40 years and has recently stepped back and are really kind of hands off, which means we are beginning to lose data going forward. So it's becoming more difficult to track the peyote trade and figure out what is happening. Okay, so some of the reasons. Okay. So some of the reasons that I became interested in looking at the peyote trade are because of various factors that indicated that it was in decline. And while I'm not particularly focusing right now on the impacts of this decline on Native American church communities and their religious practices, that was one of the driving forces, right? A religion that is based around consumption of a natural, biologically occurring sacrament. How is that religion impacted when that sacrament either disappears or becomes difficult to obtain? So that was kind of one of the broader kind of overarching interests. But here I'm focusing more on the trade itself and trying to explain why it's been declining for the last 30 years. So the evidences that we see are rising prices. We see a diminished market supply. So when people go down to Texas to purchase peyote, sometimes there's no peyote to be purchased. And also the disappearance of distributors. We have a market that had maybe a dozen distributors 20 years ago, and now we're down to, I believe, 3, maybe 4. So these are some of the primary factors that I've been focusing on. So we can look at peyote sales over the last 30 years, and you can see the bold line there is the number of individual buttons sold per year, and they're typically sold by the thousand. And when I talk about a peyote button, I'm talking about the top of the cactus, which grows above ground and is harvested. So each button is basically the whole top of a single plant. And you can also see the change in price over the last 30 years. So we see a significant inverse relationship between the supply, right, and the cost of that commodity. So looking at this, we can look at this inverse relationship and say this looks primarily like a supply and demand problem, but that would be kind of an oversimplification of this issue. Right. We do see diminished supplies. We see increased price. So that suggests, right, as supplies decrease, prices go up because the commodity is in more demand and people are willing to pay more for it. But I want to go beyond this kind of simplistic explanation. So in my study, I use this theory. It's a social economic theory known as access theory. which suggests that resources are not accessed in a linear fashion. It's not simply that the peyote distributor has peyote and the religious consumer, the NAC member, wants peyote. There's actually a complex network of mechanisms that facilitate access, right, and facilitate this exchange between the distributor and the consumer. So in access theory, instead of this sort of linear relationship between supply and demand, we really have a complex variety of different commodity chains that are happening. So here in this map, we can see several of the important participants in this trade. You have landowners, distributors, harvesters or pickers, and the NAC members that are purchasing or obtaining this commodity. And we can see that the peyote can travel through any number of different commodity chains in order to reach the final consumer. Some of these are licit transfers, which means they are going through licensed and legal pathways, and others are illicit. There's often discussion about problems with illicit transfers of peyote, or people going in and harvesting it and taking it to college campuses or wherever. But the evidence that we find through kind of the records kept by Texas Department of Law and Safety demonstrate that most of the peyote that they are confiscating, they're confiscating it from individuals within this access framework. So the peyote that they're confiscating is not peyote that is going to people outside of the Native American Church. There may be some that goes out, but predominantly these illicit transfers ultimately end up, that peyote ultimately ends up in the hands of the Native American Church. So with this theory, we see that each actor within this map of actors and economic exchanges has unique access mechanisms or tools that allow them to participate in this market and to be successful. So some of these mechanisms include legal rights, right? So the peyote distributors, they get a license. They are then able to employ individuals and give them legal protections to pick peyote. Members of the Native American Church most of them have legal protections for their own possession and use of peyote. Obviously, another way to access this resource is illegally and through illicit means. And finally, we have structural and relational access mechanisms, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means and why those are important. Okay, so some of these include things such as technology. So, for example, South Texas is not the most economically well-off part of the United States. So people need some fairly simple technology. You have to have a truck, right, in order to get out onto the ranches and pick this medicine. You have to have capital because you have to pay licensing fees. You have to pay landowners for access to their land. The distributors have to pay people to go out and pick the peyote. They have to know where to find it. They have to know how to harvest it. And they need these social relationships. They need to know people who are good pickers. They need to know landowners. They need to know members of the Native American Church. So all of these different things are really important to the success of distributors and other individuals within this market. And if any individual is missing one of these mechanisms, then that's going to be a problem for their continued participation and success in this market. So instead of a linear sort of supply-demand issue, we see that we have all these other factors that play a role in determining whether and how members of the Native American Church have access to peyote, right? So we have issues around technology, capital, labor, know-how, and these social relationships. So all these factors mediate these relationships between the distributors and the consumers, and mediate the degree to which Native American Church members have access to peyote. Okay, so then when we look at the rising costs of peyote and try to explain why these prices are going up, we've looked at diminished supply. Okay, obviously supply is going to have an impact on pricing, because when supply goes down and if demand remains the same or goes up, obviously the price is going to go up. But we have other factors to look at as well. One that I mentioned earlier is the disappearance of the distributors, right? So if you have fewer people competing in a market, the fewer people that compete, the more the market heads towards monopoly-like conditions, where prices can potentially be artificially inflated just because of the lack of competition, right? Another issue is increased licensing fees. So the higher the fees go, the more difficult, the more fees the distributors have to pay for, and the more difficult it is for people to participate in the market, because they have to meet this economic kind of bottom. They've got to be able to get on the economic playing field before they can participate in this market. Other issues we looked at are increased economic opportunities. Southern Texas has been growing quite a lot in the last 30, 40 years, as well as other parts of the state. And as the population grows, the economy grows, right? And different opportunities arise. And harvesting peyote is agricultural type work. And the people that I talked to a number of young people who were harvesting peyote to help their families. They all talk about really, they love being out on the ranches, being outside. But the flip side to it is that this is agricultural work. And there's a lot of young people that don't want to be seen as agricultural workers or participate in something that's seen as agricultural work. Another issue is land access and gas prices, right? The distributors and pickers have to be able to have access to land in order to pick. And part of that access depends on having money to put gas in the tank and get out to the ranches that actually have significant supplies of peyote for harvesting. Okay, so I want to briefly look at how some of these factors relate to the pricing of peyote. So we can look at the decline in dealers, and here's a chart going back it goes from 1986 to 2012, and we can see around the late 90s, mid to late 90s, we see kind of a peak and then a steep decline, and an inverse relationship with that decline with the pricing of peyote, right? And this is a significant relationship here. So obviously the disappearance of distributors is contributing to this price increase. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, as distributors disappear, the market leads to more monopoly-like conditions. There's not as much need to be competitive. Another reason for the distributors disappearing is the rising business expenses, right? The cost of licenses goes up, the cost of accessing land goes up. And also we have a situation where demand continues to exceed supply, which also supports these price increases. And the other factor, just to attach that on, is that the fewer distributors there are, the less peyote is going to be harvested. And part of this is due to distributors, as I mentioned earlier, rely on relationships, right? So as distributors disappear from the market, their relationships also disappear. So maybe somebody had relationships with certain ranchers and landowners and had access to those lands for picking. But when they disappear from the market, that relationship with that landowner also disappears, and that land may not open up again to other distributors or pickers. But other barriers for distributors, one of the issues that we look at is that in order to get federally licensed and licensed by the state of Texas, distributors have to have a clean criminal record. So one of the issues is this is a market that takes place in South Texas. It's on the border. There's lots of movement of drugs and people over the border. There's a lot of money involved in those types of activities. And there's a lot of people that are involved in these activities. And culturally, the stigma around having legal troubles is less in South Texas, in my view and my experience, than that stigma is in other parts of the country. So often when you have a business that's a family business that gets passed from father to son or to niece or nephew, if that son or that niece or nephew has a criminal record, there is a barrier to continuing that family business. Some of the other barriers are financial. So we look at the federal licenses are $1,500. People have to pay state licenses, which is fairly negligible, but they have to have a secure workspace, something that is they're working with a controlled substance, right? So the feds expect them to have a workspace that nobody can access except for the license holder and their employees. Leases are going to vary. People may lease land by the day or the hour or by the week. And depending on what they do, that can be very expensive. And then they have to pay employees as well. So anybody that wants to start a business in peyote, they're looking probably at about $5,000 up front. And when we look at a part of the country where the median income for a family of four is under $30,000 a year, coming up with $5,000 to start this type of business is going to be a big barrier for people. Okay, so here, one of the issues that I brought up are these licensing fees. So back in the 70s, when this started, the fees were really low. We're looking at a 200, let's see, I believe no, it was maybe $25 at the beginning. And so we can see as the fees increase and they have these kind of staged increases, we can also see a relationship with the decline in people participating in the market. So something that started off, I believe, as a $25 fee and is nearly $1,600. So this has been a huge increase over the last 40, 50 years. Okay, so startup costs may exceed $3,000 or probably closer to $5,000. And you're going to need access to land and need access to workers. So I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I want to make sure we still have time for questions. But we see businesses have been allowed to lapse. So as people get older, they retire. Criminal records may prevent children or other relatives from taking over the business, and also decreased access to land. So certain distributors may have just a certain number of acres that they have access to. If they have harvested everything on that land or over harvested in a way that has led to the death of particular individual plants or groups of plants, then they may not be able to return there. Or if the landowner has sold or transferred that land to somebody else, then that can impact their ability to access harvesting land as well. Okay. So another issue is economic and population growth. So as cities like Laredo and Rio Grande City have grown, there are more full-time job opportunities. Another important factor to consider is that in the 70s, many people that distributed and picked peyote were migrant workers. So they would go and they'd go up to Washington, or they'd go over to Tennessee to pick tobacco, or they'd go up to Nebraska to work in factories. And then after those picking seasons or canning seasons are done, they'd come back to Texas and they would pick peyote in the off season. Typically September through March. So for historically, this has been not a full-time business for people. This has been part-time to supplement migrant work. And as the population has grown and as the practice of migrant work has declined in South Texas, for many of the people that were once participating, it's no longer enough, right? It's not sufficient for a full-time job to support these families. So that's another kind of cultural, socioeconomic change that we see happening. And here again, we can look one of my charts comparing distributor decline with population growth. We see another inverse relationship. As the population in South Texas grows, the number of distributors declines. Oops. Okay, and just to give another perspective, looking at population growth again, we can see a parallel relationship between price increases and population growth. So that's just another way to really kind of confirm this connection. Okay. So I'm going to try to go briefly over the next few slides. But access to land, so as a population grows, development also grows. So areas that were once ranch land are now being developed for housing or malls or things like that. And as roads are built more, there's more access to land. That land gets picked over. And pickers are finding they have to drive farther in order to pick. And I talked to some pickers that said, I know where a lot of peyote grows, but I'm going to have to put, $40 in the tank, to get there. And I'd rather just drive down the road and only, maybe pick a few hundred buttons and not have to put that much money in the tank than to do that, drive a couple hours and get, several thousand buttons. So these are the economic considerations and choices that people are making. So just to highlight this connection again with gas and peyote prices, we do see a parallel here where gas and peyote prices are tracking each other, right? As gas prices go up, peyote prices go up because the pickers have to drive farther. So when we look at scarcity, we have a number of things that we're looking at, right? Diminished supply obviously is one of them. But this is really difficult to measure because we don't know what the actual peyote populations look like. We don't know how large they are or how healthy we are. We know that there are places that are over-harvested, but we also know that there's a lot of land that is just not accessible. So to summarize, when we look at the decline in the peyote trade, we can look at 5 primary factors that really explain this decline. One is the increase in the licensing fees, the exorbitant $1,500+ a year. We look at local population economic growth, diminished access to land is huge, increased gas prices, and of course, scarcity is a major, major issue, but it's not the only issue that explains what's happening with this market. So, not much can be done about population growth or gas prices, although I understand that companies are like giving away gas now. Nobody's given me any yet, but apparently gas prices are in free fall, but I'm not sure that's going to help us at this moment in time. And the DEA treats distributors essentially the same as pharmacists and research firms. So pharmacists and research firms are dealing with budgets in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a startup peyote distributor is not looking at this type of money, right? So this is just not a fit. They don't fit into this, and the decreasing these fees could provide opportunities for new distributors. So if we have new distributors, they could create competition, they could increase the overall supply, and potentially that could halt the rising prices and improve service. But that doesn't help us ultimately with the issues of conservation, which is also a major area of concern. So thank you very much. And I hope I didn't use up too much time so we can have some questions and some interesting dialogue.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, we have a little over 10 minutes for some questions. And thank you for everyone for submitting questions in the Ask a Question section. One of the first questions that someone asked was, what kind of grow rights are being fought for? And how can folks become more active in supporting that? Okay, so this is a really it's really kind of a tricky area, and it's kind of tricky to understand because this goes to some deep kind of cultural issues and understandings around peyote as medicine and sacrament within the Native American Church. So the Native American Church, you may hear about it talked about as if it's this sort of monolithic religious organization, and it simply isn't. It's more of kind of a confederacy of different kind of focal points and chapters, and the beliefs are different from place to place. So one of the issues with cultivation is that there are some within the church that don't support it, and they believe that planting peyote takes away its spiritual potency, right? So peyote that grows in its natural environment is peyote that is put there by the Creator, and it's imbued with the power and spirit of the Creator. And by planting it and cultivating it, you are fundamentally altering the relationship between people and the peyote plant itself and the Creator who created this medicine. So this is one of the issues. There are others within the church that support cultivation. There are many in the church that for decades have
have come and gathered plants from Texas and taken them home to not necessarily cultivate, but to have in their home. And there have been people that have tried, cultivating it in the past. So there is a history of this relationship between some native peoples and growing and caring for plants in their homes. But this is kind of a culturally hot issue, which is one of the issues we see. But there have been, and some components of the church that are looking at this.
Can you talk about the impact of people ordering peyote from black market sources or for DIY consumption versus consuming them in the context of the Native American church?
In the context of what?
The Native American church, or the more traditional.
Well, within the regulated market, people can order peyote through the mail, and they just have to put a DEA sort of a packing slip on that. So there is peyote that goes through the mail, not every day, but that does happen. But in terms of sort of the illicit aspects, the evidence from Texas doesn't really support that there is a significant degree of illicit harvesting or sales that are going to people outside of the Native American church. There does seem to be indications that peyote is being harvested in Mexico and brought back, and that there are probably members within the church that are involved in that, but also other individuals who are outside of the church that are using that peyote for other purposes.
So the question, is growing legal in Mexico? Could you speak to that?
Gosh, it's been a while since I've looked at the issues in Mexico. My colleague Bia, who I see here in the discussion board, and I wrote a paper on some of the legal issues in Mexico a few years ago. But I do not believe that cultivation of peyote is currently recognized as a legal practice. And even though Mexico states that it supports its indigenous people and is interested in protecting the religious practices of its indigenous people in relation to peyote, we still see that people like the Huichol and Tarahumara and Cora and other peyote peoples in Mexico still face harassment by law enforcement and still face the threat of arrest in some circumstances, even though technically those practices are supposed to be respected.
And then Bia wrote here in the comments section, everyone sees, no, it's not legal.
Thanks, Bia.
Someone had a question about how has the size of the buttons that are being harvested impacted pricing?
Okay, wonderful question. And sometimes I forget to talk about this. But one of the interesting things about the peyote market in Texas is that it's always been tracked by the button and the number of buttons that are sold. And of course, the button is the top part of the cactus that grows above ground. So the strange thing about this is that not all buttons are created equal. Some are very large and some are very small. So 1,000 buttons here is not necessarily the same as 1,000 buttons over here, because one could weigh 50 pounds and the other could weigh 100 pounds. But it's still sold by the button, not by the pound. So one of the things that we're missing from the data is that the Texas Department of Public Safety doesn't have records on the weight of peyote that's sold, just the number of buttons. But we can look at the size of peyote from 20, 30 years ago, and the average sizes are significantly different. So they're significantly larger 20, 30 years ago, and now they're actually quite small. So when we look at the rising prices that I showed in some of those charts, those price increases don't account for the fact that the buttons that are being sold today are only a fraction of the size that they were 30 years ago.
Someone had a question about the research on the effects of mescaline and production of synthetic product and how that resembles naturally occurring peyote.
Okay, so I think I understand the question. So one of the issues, right, is that peyote is a complex pharmacological product. I mean, there are over 50 different alkaloids that are known from the peyote cactus. It's not entirely understood how they all interact with one another and what other compounds might contribute to the particular experiences or effects produced by peyote. So you have something that if people have heard of the entourage effect before, this is something that's come up, as the medical cannabis has developed, right? The feds tried to pawn off THC pills on cancer patients in the 80s, and that was a disaster because it really ignored the fact that cannabis is a complex plant, and we're really looking at some sort of balance of an entourage effect with cannabis that can't be encapsulated. So I would say the same is true of peyote, is that you have something that is a unique, pharmacological product that, while mescaline is considered to be the primary active compound, it's hardly the only thing that contributes to its effects.
I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the intersection of your work and research with the work of the decriminalized nature movement, how those come together.
Right. So, I have a very different perspective than the decriminalized nature folks, and I think they've got some good energy and good ideas, but I think there's really been a failure to engage with Native communities and to understand what peyote means to Native communities. So, one of the things we have here is kind of this idea that, that peyote is a natural psychedelic plant. And, as something that's natural and grows, it should belong to everybody, and everybody should have a right to access it. And I understand and I sympathize with that perspective. But I think it's also a perspective that is being voiced in a vacuum, right? One that ignores the historical realities of Native peoples in this country, and the historical development of the Native American Church itself, which was largely as a response against the ethnocide perpetrated by the United States government and genocide in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that this is something that Native communities have used for resilience and to overcome the historical traumas related with these things. So I think to some degree there are people that think, oh, well, this was 150 years ago, right? Like this is in the deep past. But I'd just like to point out that as we go through this coronavirus pandemic, that the federal government has not given Native communities any resources to combat this epidemic. Tribes are being stripped of reservation lands, and the federal government is considering stripping tribes of their federally recognized status while everybody is consumed with this coronavirus. And I mention this just to really bring it to point that there is this focus within Decriminalized Nature and others that there is this supposed racial disparity, and that Native people get to use this, and white people or non-Native people don't get to use it. And I just wonder why that should be the focus when we still have Native communities that are struggling and dealing with this kind of stuff, where their communities continue to be under siege by the federal government and states across the country. And I feel like this is a time for us to show some solidarity with our Native brothers and sisters, and not to be making a stink about non-Native peoples wanting to have a peyote experience at this point in time.
Thank you so much for that. So important, such an important topic. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this session. Thank you so much for everyone who submitted questions. Thank you so much, Kevin, for your wonderful presentation and really thoughtful responses to your questions. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Happy to be here. Thank you all for attending. And if people had other questions, hopefully you got my contact information off my slides. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and please be sure to attend our other peyote talks. We've got some great people. Don Davis is talking later, Martin Terry, Anya Ermakova, and I'm sure there are other people out there as well. So anyway, thank you for being here, and please enjoy this wonderful conference, and thank you to BIA for putting this all together.